I think that's working. Well, good morning.
Good morning.
Good to see everybody. We are in studying David, per the usual. I'd like to introduce our chapter this morning a little differently than I've ever, I think, maybe ever have introduced a class. Maybe, I'm not sure. No, I take that back. I've done this before. But anyway, by way of introduction, I'd like to introduce you to something. He stands almost 17 feet tall. He weighs over 12,000 pounds. He's almost 525 years old. He was nicknamed the Giant even before he was created, which is ironic for many reasons. He was left unattended for over 25 years because men deemed him flawed and unworkable. That is, until one man saw what others could not see. For 3 years, this man worked tirelessly on this giant. And what emerged was something no one expected. A masterpiece. In the late 1400s, a giant slab of white marble was excavated from Tuscany, Italy. A few different renowned sculptors of the day were commissioned over the years to carve from it something beautiful. But each one gave up because the stone had many, many flaws. So it sat for over 25 years until a young man in his 20s, early 20s, took on the task. And today, it still stands as one of the greatest pieces of art ever created. Any idea? It would be Michelangelo's David.
Wow.
It wasn't that no one had ever even sculpted David before, and it wasn't even that nobody had ever sculpted David in light of his battle with Goliath. It was that every artist who had depicted David prior to Michelangelo had depicted David in standing in triumph with a foot on the head of Goliath. But if you've seen pictures or have seen in person the actual statue, then you know that you see David portrayed in quite a different light. David is standing, but he's standing at the ready. His sling is slung over his shoulder. His eyes are acutely fixed, as if contemplative or determined. His muscles are even shown carved as tents. And he's standing as if he's just seconds away from hurling that stone at Goliath of Gath. This masterpiece was and still is a remarkable feat to this day. Not just the meticulous task of carving a massive stone into an unparalleled piece of Renaissance art, but because 3,000 years later, today even, David still stands in our minds as a giant man of faith. And so today we look at this occasion, 1 Samuel 17, David and Goliath, the occasion that marks David's transformation from a shepherd of flocks to a leader of people. So if you will, turn in your Bibles to 1 Samuel 17. This is a relatively long chapter. Many scholars have noted that this is on purpose. There are a lot of details given in this chapter. A lot of dialogue is recorded in this chapter, and most people agree that it's for a reason. This is supposed to be significant. This is supposed to be important, and so there was hardly any detail was left out, I would say, I guess. Few details were left out. Anyway, I have a map because you know how I do. So if you'll take one of those and pass it along. This will just help us see what we're looking at in the first 3 verses.
Just pitch it down.
This is the setting. This is the setting for where we are in Canaan. This map that you have is a map of Canaan land, not all of it, but just a portion of it, and then you'll see that it is honed in on this square. Do you see how it's a little square and then it's made bigger there at the bottom of the map? So that we can see it more closely. If you'd like to, you can mark a few things. There is on this map, do you see Gath? All right, this is where Goliath was from. Now, I don't know if y'all remember, but the Philistines had 5 major cities. Gath was one of those. Ekron was one. You see it directly north from there. Gath, there was about 5 miles between Gath and Ekron. That'll give you a little better. 5, about 5. And then Ashdod, that was another Philistine city. So there's 3 right there. The other 2 are Ashkelon and Gaza, but they're not on this map because they're further south. But those would be the other 2. Anyway, so between Gath and Ekron, there's about 5 miles. And then you see to the east of Gath, Azekah and Soko.
What?
If you see Gath and you kind of follow that little red squiggly line to the right, there's Azekah and Soko. Okay, so between Azekah and Soko, that's about 3 miles. And then if you look even further east, you'll see Bethlehem on that map. So it's just pretty much directly east from Soko. That's about 14-mile difference. So these are the Bethlehem, Soko, Azekah are these are the places that are mentioned in verses 1 through 3 in 1 Samuel 17. So it just says here in verse 1, the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle and were gathered at Soko, which belonged to Judah. They encamped between Soko and Azekah in Ephes Dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side with a valley between them. Okay, so between Azekah and Soko is a valley called Elah.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. Azekah and Soko.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a valley called Elah, and the Philistines were encamped on the south side of that valley, and Israel was encamped on the north side of that valley. My understanding is that this town was strategically important to both the Israelites and the Philistines because, well, first of all, it belonged to Judah, so it was already, the Israelites were trying to defend their territory. But it was important to the Philistines because they, this valley gave them access to further into Israelite territory more than all the others had. And they already had, I think, from what I understand in biblical history, they had control of 2 other valleys. And so I think those are both recorded somewhere. And I have that in my notes somewhere, but that's not important. But anyway, this was Israelite territory. Judah, this was Judah's territory, and the Philistines were encroaching on it, and so, if the Philistines would have won, they would have had better access into Bethlehem, etc. All that, it's up there to the north, you see that? Bethlehem, Jerusalem, Gibeah, etc. So this was pretty critical, that it was strategic. Anyway, they were there for a reason, that's the whole point. It wasn't just a lot of land out in the middle of nowhere that they were fighting over. This was very, very important. Good morning. Glad you're here. We're in 1 Samuel 17. If you'll hand Melinda a map. We're just looking at this map, Melinda. I'm not going to go back over it, but you can go back and watch it later if you want. Catch up. Okay, so we're in the Valley of Elah. And it's an important place. Militarily, it's strategic. Okay, so then verses 4 through 7, it says a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet. Okay, I'm not going to go through all that. We've read that 1,000. I'm sure you've read that a lot before. I do want to point out he's described in my version at least as a champion. I think even in the ESV it says that, which is a little bit unfortunate. I'm not sure why they put that word there. The word in the Hebrew actually means the man in between, like a middleman. But in this instance, in this occasion, there was combat well known as representative combat. Because you know what Goliath does here. He says, send me out a man to fight. Mm-hmm. And if I win, then you'll be our servants. But if you win, then we'll be your servant. A representative combat. So instead of losing a lot of people in battle, well, we'll just lose one on behalf of the many, right? Okay. This was common. I don't know that it was common to Israel, though. They never had that necessarily. They had judges, like Samson, he did his own thing, and against the Philistines, but it was really common among heathen nations, I guess you could say. And so that's what that word means in the Hebrew, a man in between. So it makes it sound like he's a champion warrior, like this really successful, and maybe he was, but that's not what it's not what the word is. But anyway, so this is somebody who is going to represent the Philistine army on their behalf, and so he, is asking for somebody to come out from Israel's army to represent Israel so that they can battle together. Okay, his height, of course, a cubit and a span. A cubit was generally the length, the measurement was generally between the fingertip and the middle finger to the elbow. So, and of course that could vary. Mine's going to be smaller. What's that?
Mine says 9 feet 9 inches.
Yeah, you probably have a more modern version.
Most people say
Christian
it's about
Standard
18
Bible.
inches for a cubit, right?
Yeah, so about 1.5 feet. That's an average. Now, that's give or take depending on their size, right? And then a span was generally, from what I understand, I think it's from the thumb to the pinky, maybe like 6 inches, half a foot generally. So yes, his height, according to these measurements, would have been about 9.5 feet. He was heavily armed in the sense that he was heavily protected. He carried heavy armor, a bronze helmet on his head, a coat of mail on his chest, and the weight of that coat was, mine says 5,000 shekels of bronze, which approximates about 125 pounds. That's a lot. Mm-hmm. He had bronze armor on his legs, so he had some shin protectors down there, and he had a bronze javelin between his shoulders. He also had a spear, and that weighed about, I guess the spear head alone weighed about 15 pounds. But anyway, so that's his description. He is never designated as a giant in these verses, or even in this chapter. It's more specific than that. The verses are more specific than that.
All of those people were pretty big, though, weren't they?
No. The Philistines?
Were they not?
No.
I was thinking
No.
Never mind.
No, that's okay. There was a history of giants in the land.
Oh, okay, maybe that's what I'm
If you'll remember back as far as Joshua, when the spies were sent to Canaan land, you remember what the 10 spies came back saying? Mm-hmm. There are giants in the land and we look like grasshoppers in their sight. And so they no doubt came into contact with some, I'm sure, obviously.
I guess I judged the group by a few then, didn't I?
Yeah. But they were descended from the Anakim. I don't know, those were mentioned in Numbers 13. You can look at Joshua 11 and Joshua 14. Also, that will give you some history behind Gath even, because Goliath would have been a descendant of the Anakim. Okay, but I do think that much detail is given to this Goliath, because I think that this chapter is really kind of intended, at least in part, to serve kind of like as an object lesson of 1 Samuel 16 verse 7, where God said, I don't see as man sees. Man looks at the appearance, but I look at a man's heart. And so I think we're seeing that in chapter 17. I think that's the point of these many details, so that we can learn. Of course, David didn't see as man sees either. Of course, he saw all that. Now, all of Israel saw all that, and they feared greatly. But it didn't sway David. And so I think that's that's the kind of man God was looking for, and he's exemplifying the heart that God said he was looking for. Okay. I don't really know what else to say about that. Moving on, we have in verses 8 through 11. This is so we have, I had this outline as verses 4 through 7, the challenger, and then verses 8 through 11, the challenge. Goliath stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you, the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourself and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. And the Philistine said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. The Hebrew word for defy in verse 10 first comes out of Goliath's mouth. He's mocking, really. He's blaspheming God's military here. He is intending to defame or taunt. This isn't really a negotiation. I know he says, if you give me a man and I win, then you become our servants, and if you win, then we'll become your servants. It wasn't really a technical negotiation. It was more of a taunt, because the reason we know this is because Saul ends up for the rest of his reign fighting Philistines the whole time. So the Philistines didn't become the servants of Israel after this. Goliath was merely taunting. I say merely, but it was a serious offense. But anyway, and it worked in the sense that verse 11, Saul and all Israel were dismayed and greatly afraid. I might say more about that here in a minute. But we can move on. Okay, and then we have this next section. This is David. Now we get a little bit of insight into David in Bethlehem as he's coming on the scene here. This is verses 12 through 19. Now David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, and who had 8 sons. And the man was old, advanced in years in the days of Saul. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul to the battle. Those are the names. Verse 14, David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul. But David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And the Philistine drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. Then Jesse said to his son David, take now this food, go to the camp, supply your brothers this food, and come back and bring news. Verse 19, now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. So David is in Bethlehem. He's not in Saul's army. I've read some different commentators say that perhaps it was probably maybe because generally the year for it to be qualified, the age to be qualified is 20, right? That Numbers, I have that somewhere. Numbers 1 verse 3, Numbers 26 verse 2. So that's the minimum age, I guess. And apparently he wasn't that yet, maybe. Or perhaps maybe families were not required to send more than 3 sons to fight. If a family had 7 sons, maybe only 3 were required for military service, in which case the 3 oldest then would go. But it also could be just that the three oldest are named here because, and maybe the others went too, I don't know, but the three oldest are named here because we've already been introduced to them in chapter 16. And so to make it cohere, the writer includes their names again because we already know who they are. I don't know. Doesn't matter, David's not there. But he does go occasionally because, you know, the military then wasn't like our military in the U.S., where our military supplies every need that our soldiers require. But back then, of course, this army was new for Saul, right? And so maybe there just wasn't that. So families would support their soldiers and send food and supplies. And so David goes to do that. For 40 days, this is when we learn how long this has been going on, this standoff at the Valley of Elah. For 40 days. That's a long time. We already pointed out that Bethlehem is about 14 or 15 miles away from the valley. That's a pretty good trek. Let's see. Oh, this is a good place to talk about this. Okay, so for 40 days, this giant cried out. And for 40 days, nobody stepped forward. Now, in the ancient world, a good king was expected to go out. That's what they were there for. And that's what Israel wanted. Remember? That was their specific, we want a king to go out and fight for us. But look at what their king is doing. Nothing. He's not. And ideally in this situation, when somebody comes out and challenges you, then you want to send your best, right? Somebody comparable to fight this other person. And do you remember how Saul was described? We get a lot of details about him. He was handsome, we know that. But what else? He was tall. He was head and shoulders above the rest. So he was taller than anybody. I think that's why that's put in there. So that he looked like he would make a good king who could go out and fight Israel's battles. So, not only did this king not go out, but he was actually the one who would be most qualified to go out. And he still didn't do it.
He hid in the very beginning.
What's that?
He hid in the very beginning, didn't he?
Oh yeah, he hid among the equipment. He's hiding again here as a coward, really. So I tend to believe that it's no mystery who Goliath was waiting for. Goliath knew who he was calling for, I think. He knew everybody, he knew the king. He knew that Israel had a king, and that he was probably, he at least appeared the part of a warrior. And he had a little bit of success initially in his reign, but Saul did not go out. It was his job to accept the challenge on behalf of Israel, but instead he was greatly afraid like everyone else. I read somewhere where somebody said Saul, who was Israel's giant warrior, quaked before the Philistine giant. So he doesn't go. Everybody was afraid. And back to verse 11, these words I think are used here on purpose. It says there that when Saul and Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Over and over, this is a good exercise, if you wanted to do this, this is be something good to do, a good little study, would be to look up those words together. Especially in the light of when God says, do not fear or be dismayed. Do not fear nor be discouraged. God said that to Moses, Joshua. He says it over and over to his people. But here now is Israel dismayed and greatly afraid. So they have forgotten. They are depending on their earthly human king, on a human king instead of Yahweh. They have forgotten God's covenant promises to never fear the enemies, but to trust in the Lord. So okay, that's probably all I have to say about that. Does anybody have anything they want to add so far with what we've read? Okay, so then, beginning in verse 20 through verse 24, we have David coming to the valley. He rose early in the morning, verse 20. He was a sheep keeper, you remember, a shepherd. He left his sheep with a keeper and took the things that Jesse, his father, had given him. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to fight and shouting for the battle. 21. For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper, ran to the army, and came and greeted his brothers. Then as he talked with them, there was the champion, which is the same word as in verse 4. The Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines, and he spoke according to the same words. So David heard them himself. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. Okay, so David comes to the valley at the sign of first morning light. David leaves his sheep with somebody else to take care of them. I don't think that David woke up that morning thinking he was going to fight a giant. Or anybody for that matter, I don't suppose. But God works and is working and providentially providing, supplying this occasion. And so David, probably for the first time in his life maybe, is hearing somebody actually blaspheme God. And he takes it very personally. Mm-hmm. But Israel had been hearing it for 40 days. And they hadn't thought anything about it, I don't guess. Didn't bother them that much.
Just never starting to believe in it.
Maybe so.
Fair enough.
Yeah, very good. And so, beginning in verse 25, we have what happens next. So then the men of Israel, they tell David what's been going on. That's verse 25. The men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches. Will give him his daughter and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel. And so then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? So you have really, in verse 25, Israel's resignation. They're just resigned to the fact that, they're going to lose. There's no hope for them, right? But then David, you have him in verse 26. You have his indignation. He's not resigning to anything. He's furious. He's indignant about this. This can't be. Because who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should say these things against God? So the people just answered him and said, so it shall be for the man who kills him. So then his brother, his oldest brother Eliab, we already know about him, right? And we get a little peek into his heart, verse 28. Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David, and he said, why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep? I know your sheep. Those few sheep, yes, that's right, those petty few sheep.
Yeah.
And I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. In other words, you're just a nosy kid. What are you doing here? You have no business here. You just keep sheep. Okay, well, it's no surprise. I think, this is probably one of the reasons why God didn't choose Eliab. He's annoyed and he's jealous of David. He may not have known exactly why David had been anointed, because the text doesn't say that anybody knew other than Samuel. David didn't even know, as far as we know. And so probably Jesse and his brothers, even though they saw it, they weren't aware. They didn't know why. But it didn't matter to Eliab. It was just the fact that he was, probably. The fact that he was found favored, right? And so I'm sure that grated against him because he was the oldest after all. And, there's a lot of blessing and stuff that comes with being the oldest in a patriarchy. But it was David, the little brother, who had been favored. But anyway, David, though, was deeply disturbed by this Philistine. He knew this wasn't just an insult. The Philistine giant wasn't just insulting Israel's army. It was an assault on the living God. And I think here we see this contrast that David really has in his own mind about the living God versus these dead gods, or these unliving gods that these enemies serve, right? They don't do anything. They're lifeless idols. We know historically that the Philistines worshipped few main gods, I guess. Baal, you remember him? Baal-zebub, sometimes he's called. His temple was in Ekron. Ekron there on your map. So they also had the goddess Ashtoreth. Remember her? Okay. And then there was Dagon. We've already been introduced to Dagon in chapter 5. 1 Samuel 5. If you've read through or did a little history reading before we even started class, that's where you'll learn that. What happened to Dagon? Do you remember? The ark. The Philistines had stole the ark of the covenant. They stole it and put it in there in the temple with Dagon, their god. And then the next morning when they came back to the temple, what did they find? Does anybody remember?
Forget so quickly, don't we?
Dagon had fallen over, and his head was dismembered from his body, as were his hands.
Oh, yeah.
So,
Not a coincidence.
do we see a connection a little bit here? Something in common. Goliath and Dagon have something in common. They both lose their heads. Oh, yeah. Dagon loses his head before the Ark of the Covenant, and Goliath is going to lose it in confrontation with David. Okay, now, continuing on. David now appears before Saul. This is verses 31 through 39. Now, when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul. And so Saul sent for him, and David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with the Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he a man of war from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear. And this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God." Moreover, David said, "The Lord, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." So Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head. He also clothed him with a coat of mail. David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk. for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them. So David took them off. Okay. So David here is here before Saul. He's brought there before Saul because David's saying, who is this guy among the men, among the army? And so the army's like, oh, okay, well, maybe this guy thinks he is somebody. So they take him to Saul. I mean, he's acting like, David's acting like he can do something about this situation. And so responsible soldiers will then take that man to the king so that he can tell the king himself. And so that's what happens here. But David takes one look at him and says, who do you think you are to go out against this giant? You're a youth. You're not even a man of war. And anyway, but David gives his resume, right, with keeping the sheep and protecting the flock by killing lions and bears, apparently. So then, I don't know about you, but it seems a little odd, surprising, that Saul then goes, oh, okay, go ahead. And the Lord be with you.
You go.
Yeah.
I'll stay here.
Yeah.
So for some reason, Saul agrees to let this young man go and fight this giant. I don't know. But David's fully confident, of course. He knows what he has done in the past, but it's not that he's confident in that. He's confident in the Lord who has delivered him and used him in the past to deliver him from harm against a lion and a bear. And has used his skill before to defeat a lion and a bear.
And he gave all the credit to God
That's
for
exactly
those
right.
things.
That's
Yeah.
exactly right. So it wasn't that David, of course, he had, I guess you could say, had some confidence in his own skill, but he knew that it was because of God that he had those skills, and that God is the one who delivered him. So he does give the glory to God in that sense, and so he knows this is, this Philistine giant won't be any different than a lion or a bear. So his confidence didn't rest in his own prowess, but in the power of the living God. Let's see here. Again, Saul references David's youth, which may indicate that he was under 20, and therefore couldn't serve in the military. But David, like I said, gives his resume there. And amazingly, Saul agrees to let David go and fight. The Lord be with you, he says. And of course, we do know the Lord was with him. This is in 1 Samuel 16, verse 13, when he was anointed. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him. So the Lord is with him. And then Saul gave David his own military clothes. You remember that Israel was not armed with weapons, iron weapons. They had farming implements, probably, and whatever else they could fashion, I suppose. But they were not skilled in iron. The Philistines were. And so that's, I think contributes to the whole description of Goliath here. But we do know from reading through this text that Saul had some armor and a sword, and his son Jonathan as well. Because Jonathan then later gives David his armor. I don't know if you remember that. But anyway, those two at least had, and maybe others maybe other sons of Saul had armor and swords, but not the general populace of the army. They didn't have anything like that. So Saul gives all of this to David to wear, and he tries it all on, but he's not used to wearing that. He's not used to wearing those things. And there are a couple of things to note about this. I think it's unfortunate, like I said before, especially with Bible class, children's Bible class curriculum, or videos or books. You often see a little boy David in armor that's just, drowning him. It's just, too big and too weighty, and he's too little. And I don't think that's the case at all. I think this helps us to see that David was probably a pretty good stature himself, that he could even fit into Saul's. So it wasn't a matter of him not fitting into Saul's armor, but it was a matter of being able to wield it. He wasn't used to wearing it.
He didn't need it. Thank God.
Well, yeah, but he just wasn't even used to wearing it. And so it was more of an encumbrance to him and not going to be an aid to him like it would be to somebody who was used to wearing it. Okay. The other thing that I think might be interesting to note is why maybe Saul had a little bit of an ulterior motive to clothe David in the king's armor.
Mm.
The king himself was too cowardly to go out and fight this giant. But, you know, what if a man who looked like the king went out to fight the giant, and then the king could get the credit because it looked like he went out to fight the giant. So there may be some ulterior motive here for Saul trying to clothe David in his armor.
Or maybe he just felt guilty because he knew he should be the one out.
Yeah.
Maybe the least he could do is give him the armor.
I have something here. Let's see. What do I have next? Oh, no, I don't want to do that. Oh, I do want to read this part. This is, I found somebody who said this when I was studying for this, and I thought this was very helpful, and I think it makes a very good point. I'll just read the paragraph. It's not very long. But these are not my words. This is somebody else's words. The writer's inclusion of the clothing incident might serve two functions. First, to preserve an unusual but interesting occurrence in the background of the Goliath event, indicating the greater value of divine enablement over human devices.
Mm.
Second, and more importantly, I think this is really awesome, to symbolize David's rejection of Saul's approach to kingship. Saul chose to dress in royal clothing, such as all the other nations have. David wore none of it. Mm-hmm. Instead, he would identify with the great shepherd leaders of days gone by. Mm-hmm. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, mm-hmm. all men who lived by faith in the promises of God. I thought that was really good.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It makes a really good point there. Okay, so then we have beginning in verse 40. All the way through verse 54, and I'm not going to read all that because that's a lot. This is a long chapter. But from 40 to 54, we have the whole David and Goliath event. Verse 40, I will read some of this. He takes his staff in his hand, and he went to the brook and chose for himself 5 smooth stones, put them in his shepherd bag, and took his sling. And then he drew near to the Philistine. The Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and along with the Philistine's shield bearer. And then the Philistine looked at David and was like, who are you? Of course, then, begins the taunting again and the trash talk, I guess, here. And I love verse 43. I will always love verse 43. So the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" In other words, the Philistine saw this guy with nothing but a staff, a stick in his hand, and really that's it. He had a sling and he had a pouch, but that didn't look like it enough to make Goliath think of anything, and so all he concentrates on is the stick, the staff. Mm-hmm. And so that's what he says, to chide David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And then the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And then he threatens David, verse 44. But then verse 45, 46, 47, I will read these because this is what David says, and it's good. Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." That's a good speech.
Mm.
A very good one. And so it was, verse 48, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. That's significant.
Mhm.
I know a lot of application has been made there about facing your fears, running toward your fear instead of running away from it. Most people tend to run away, but with the Lord, we can always run to it. We don't have to fear with the Lord. So then we know David put his hand in his bag, took out the stone, slung it, struck the Philistine. He sank to the earth, fell on his face to the ground. And verse 50, he prevailed with a sling and a stone and killed the Philistine, but there was no sword to take his head off, so he runs over to the Philistine dead there and takes his sword, cuts his head off. And then it says at the end of verse 51, when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. So they start running,
Mhm.
because now, if this one man can do this to us, then maybe they have other men like David who can do this to us, to the rest of us. And so they take off, but the children of Israel pursue them. It says in verse 52, the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley and to the gates of Ekron. So you can see on your map where that is. It's several miles away. Where am I? Oh, and the wounded of the Philistines fell along the road to Shaaraim, even as far as Gath and Ekron. Then the children of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their tents. So they chased and killed many, many, many Philistines, verse 53, and plundered them. So they had a lot of bounty to come home with. And then in verse 54 is interesting. David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. Little trophy, right? Okay, so I'm not sure what else I got to say about this. 5 stones, let's talk about that. Why do you suppose David picked up 5? I've never really thought about it before until I
hadn't
was
thought
preparing
about
for
it.
this class.
Yeah.
I don't know, 5 just in case. I don't know, 5. Maybe that's all that fit in his bag. And also the other thing, stones, especially you see, especially in movies or books or children's Bible class courses, and I've done this too, and I've been teaching this. I'll bring rocks to class, but I bring little bitty rocks.
Yeah.
You know, littler rocks. But apparently, historically, from what I've read, the stones for slinging, this wasn't an uncommon skill.
Mm.
If you remember in Judges, I can't remember the chapter. I know I wrote it somewhere. Somewhere in Judges. The Benjamites had this skill. They were left-handed and really skillful in, not all of them, but I don't remember, 500 of them or something, I don't remember, in slinging stones. But historically, apparently, the rocks would have been kind of like the size of tennis balls, more than just, you know, a pebble in your yard. But they would have been a little bit larger than I've thought of before. And which, if you got hit with one of those, you know, and I guess they could, you know, you could sling them as far as like 100 miles an hour, and that's a lot. That's a lot of power. I know that, have you ever watched baseball and watched a pitcher pitch in the major leagues and how they get up to 90, 92, you know, miles an hour, and those balls are fast, and when they hit the player, even in the helmet or, you know, somewhere that's protected, that's a lot of weight of power.
Can be deadly.
Yes, very much so. So that's really what we're dealing with here. Now the shield carrier that went before Goliath was supposed to protect against those kind of projectiles, right? But David, I guess, was so skilled.
Not to invade him here.
Yeah,
Unless
I
it was
know,
that
unless it was a
big.
really huge shield bearer. But anyway, so 5 of them, I don't know. I've read different things. People say that he picked up 5 because Goliath had 4 brothers. And perhaps his brothers were there, so he was going to go after them too. I think it's 2 Samuel 21:22 that says he had 4 brothers.
Maybe that's what he normally carried. That was what he was
Maybe
skilled to
so.
do.
Yeah, maybe
That's
so.
just-
Some people have said that, well, there's 5 books of the Torah, so he picked up 5 stones. Or maybe just in case, or like you said, that's all. Maybe that was all that could fit in his shepherd's bag. Maybe that was heavy enough for his shepherd's bag.
Yeah.
Maybe that was all he could find. I don't know. But anyway, there were 5.
Maybe he needed extra weight or something.
I
I
don't
know.
know.
Throw them all at once.
I don't know. But anyway, he had the advantage at a distance, that's for sure. Goliath did not have the advantage for distance fighting.
Yeah.
He couldn't get very far with all that weight that he was carrying, not just as a person, but then on his body. But he would have had the advantage at close combat. But David didn't have to get to that. All David had though was a stick, for close combat. So, they were unevenly matched in that sense. But the Lord was on David's side, of course. So, anyway, I don't want to say that. I think I already said that. Let's see what else I've got here. No. I don't know. Let's see what time it is. Okay, I will say this part. In verse 54, I don't know if anybody found this unusual, but it says that David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem. Why did he do that?
That's what I was wondering.
Why did he take it to
To show
Jerusalem?
him, this is what God can do for you if you'll just,
Well, Jerusalem wasn't even part of Israel yet.
oh, that's right.
It was still a heathen city. David eventually rules from there.
Maybe so the word would spread.
But, there's been, so I don't know exactly why, it's unclear. But Jerusalem at this time was controlled by the Jebusites. It wasn't part of Israel yet, so not yet anyway. David does make it his capital, I guess, during his reign, but eventually, but not yet. So, I don't know. It could be that this Jerusalem, here's 4 things to think about. Maybe one of these, maybe not any of these, I don't know. Number 1, Jerusalem refers to a suburb in the area around Jerusalem and not exactly the Jebusite city of Jerusalem that David later captures in 2 Samuel 5. So maybe it was another different
Suburb of what?
of Jerusalem.
Jerusalem?
Jerusalem around, Jerusalem referring to a suburb in the area of Jerusalem.
Mm.
I don't know. Maybe, number 2, David intended it to frighten the Jebusites and other enemies of Israel. Like we said in 2 Samuel 5, David later successfully invades Jerusalem and renames it the city of David, and it becomes its capital. So maybe the head of Goliath acts as kind of a security deposit to Jerusalem. Number 3, another option is that maybe another one is this. Jerusalem was a central place where non-Jebusites could come and barter and trade and display spoils of war. So it was a site where people came to do that. And so maybe that's why he went there. Other people went there after war to, I don't know. Anyway, had to do with the spoils of war, and so he goes and says, look what I got.
Makes sense.
But he doesn't trade it, because we later see that he brings it to Saul. But unless he went to Jerusalem after that, I don't know. With the chronology here, it's sketchy sometimes. And then number 4, some people believe that this verse is referring to what David ultimately did years later with Goliath's head. Like he held on to it for that long and then eventually took it with him
Yuck.
to Jerusalem when he made it his capital. I have a lot of questions about that.
So he took it to Jerusalem, but he didn't leave it there? Or he did leave it there?
No, I don't know that he left it there.
Because then he wouldn't have had it to take later.
Right.
Left it.
Yeah, there's a lot. I don't know. The whole bottom line is don't know
Trophy.
why he took it there. But he made the journey there, and that's far from the Valley of Elah to go to Jerusalem and do that. But anyway, the text records that he took it there for some reason. And then he put Goliath's armor in his own tent. Okay. And then finally, to close out this chapter, we have in verses 55 through 58, a flashback. The writer here makes use of a flashback in these verses. When Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, okay, so this was happening before when all this was starting. When Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, as your soul lives, O king, I don't know. So the king said, inquire whose son this young man is. Then, as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? So David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. Okay, and that's how the chapter ends.
Mhm.
But you know as well as I do, there were no chapter divisions when the letters or the books were written originally. So chapter 18 goes on and continues the story. It continues the narrative. Basically, now we're introduced to Jonathan loving David now. I think that Jonathan and David were of the same kind of heart. So they clicked. We'll have more to say about him next week. And we also learn, of course, that the ladies sing a song. The women sing a song. Saul has killed his thousands, but David has slain his 10,000s.
Mm.
Well, that didn't sit very well with Saul. And so verse 9 says, so Saul eyed David from that day forward. And his hatred only grew. It grew so much that he eventually said to David, okay, here, I want you to marry my oldest daughter. And of course David was like, well, who am I to be the king's son-in-law?
Mm.
And eventually the text says that daughter was given to somebody else. But then Saul had a daughter who actually loved David. And so Saul said, I'm going to give you this daughter. And David says, I don't have anything to give you in order to acquire her, like a, what's that called?
Dowry.
Dowry, I guess. I don't, I'm a poor, I don't have anything. And so then Saul says, well, just go out and get, do you remember what it was? 100 foreskins of the Philistines. And that'll be payment enough.
Yeah, just run out there and grab that, right?
That's romantic.
Gross.
That's nasty.
Disgusting.
And so he goes out and he doesn't get 100, he gets 200. Okay, so that's really what happens in chapter 18. So I said all that just to say this, that I have, in my history of reading 1 Samuel 17, I kind of take it as one chapter almost out of the entire book, as opposed to trying to find the flow of it in the book. And it really does flow into chapter 18. I think it just continues there with it. But like I said before, I think in the last class, some of the chronology is not what we would expect. Some of it doesn't make sense if you're trying to read it chronologically.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I still have some chronological questions that I'm still grappling with about the possibilities even of where some of these things could fit. But it doesn't take away from the fact that these things happen or anything like that. Okay. I did say some of that. What do I want to say next? To close it up, I have written here, this is what I wrote, this is not what I read anywhere, but there is a reason why that this might be the most well-known story of the Old Testament. It's heroic. It's unexpected. It's kind of like a story for the underdogs, right? It shows the power and presence of God working through one unexpected person. And it's a stalwart story of faith, really, is what it is. David, to connect us back to what I said at the very beginning of class, David was God's masterpiece long before Michelangelo carved him out of rock. But even more so, I think that we see a shadow in this chapter. I talk a lot about shadow and substance in this class. Shadow, of course, David, of course, is a shadow of Christ in and of himself. We know that. But I think here in this particular occasion, we have a pretty good shadow seen in the entire story. This is what I mean. The spiritual reality that we see in this chapter, I think, has to do with the fact that Messiah did come. The anointed one, Christ. Messiah came, and he fought a giant enemy, didn't he? He fought a giant enemy who had a mighty army. And we really are that fearful nation without hope. That's who we were. Human race really was a fearful nation without hope. Messiah comes along. The Good Shepherd comes along. Jesus referred to himself as that. The Good Shepherd came along, and he crushed the head of the giant. Right? Genesis 3:15. That was foretold that Jesus would crush the head of the serpent. He crushed the head of that giant, and now we are a hopeful people. 1 Peter 2 calls us a holy nation because of what Jesus has done. We proclaim the praises of him who called us out of darkness into his marvelous light. So that's the shadow I see, the big picture of it. Messiah came. He didn't come from anything. He wasn't anybody, family-wise or birth-wise, or he wasn't of any status or anything particular. But he came to fight a giant enemy, and he was victorious, of course. And so now we move from a fearful nation to a trusting nation, a holy nation, serving under our King. And so may God help us. There are so many practical applications that could be given from this chapter that can be taken. And you, I'm sure, have thought of your own, even while just sitting here in class. Or through the years, you've thought of your own. I just have a few listed here. Number one, may God help us to not see like others see. Which I think is the huge object lesson here about seeing how God sees. May God help us also to be zealous like David for God and God's character. May God help us not forget. Forget who it is we serve. A living God, a powerful God. We therefore don't have to fear or be discouraged or dismayed in the long run. I know we face periods and bouts of that kind of thing, but not overall. And so may God help us to trust rather than fear. David's kingship was validated here, really. Saul's kingship was validated. He was anointed, and then pretty soon after that, he went and fought the Ammonites and succeeded pretty well there. And so his kingship was established and validated. In chapter 16, David is anointed. And now you see his victory. And so I think you see God saying, now his kingship is validated. Same kind of scenario. Any thoughts or anything anybody else would like to add?
I have a question.
Yes.
Did the people of Israel doubt that David could kill Goliath?
Doubt?
Yeah.
I don't recall the text giving any inclination as to that. I don't see that. I do see that in verse 31 when it says, when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul. From what I understand, that means that David wasn't just asking for curiosity's sake. He was asking as if to provide a solution. And so that's why I said earlier, when somebody does that, then you take him to the king, because he might have the answer or the solution or something like that. And so I guess the army, at least as far as that verse goes, maybe saw something unique in him. He wasn't just asking for information like out of curiosity, just being nosy. He was inquiring because he was somebody who could do something about it.
They were probably glad someone finally was
Maybe
stepping up
so.
to do something after 40 days.
Maybe so, but yeah, that's all I can say about it that I know from the text anyway.
What I was asking is that we were wondering why that he took Goliath's head to
Oh.
Israel?
To Jerusalem.
Well, okay. This is, okay, in Israel. So it said in Israel, being deprived of burial and exposed to birds and beasts were considered worse than death itself. And then up here, when I was talking about, he took his head to Israel, he wanted to show, that there is a God, that all the earth may know there is a God in Israel. And that's why I was wondering if they doubted that he could,
Oh, yeah, the text says that he took his Goliath's head to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was not part of Israel yet.
okay,
It was still a Canaanite city, occupied by the Jebusites,
okay.
and so it didn't belong to Israel yet. Technically, it wasn't part of David's, it wasn't a part of Saul's kingdom. I think it was still in the land of Canaan, but you know as well as I do that the Israelites didn't drive out all of the heathen nations. Remember, they failed to do that. They did it a lot, but not all of them. And so that was the problem with the judges, remember that? And then your other thing, I forgot what you said.
But it still would
So
be a
he did
sign of the God of Israel. Because, all through the stories we read about, people, they're like, they've heard about
Oh,
the God
yeah,
of
yeah,
Israel.
yeah.
And so that did kinda
Yeah.
get the word out that look what happened
Yeah,
again,
this was like
you know.
a trophy. I mean, it's a visible sign of, yeah. And it reminds me, the verse you read when he said that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel in verse 46.
Mhm.
Of course, that's the way God has always acted. You remember in Exodus with the plagues, Pharaoh? That's what God said. Moses told, so that you will know that there is a God. Because, the land of Egypt had many gods. But there's one God. Well, the land of the Philistines had many gods too. Probably not as many as Egypt did, but they had a few. And so it was the same idea. This was to show who the one true God really is and his power. And he's greater than all of these, non-entities.
Yeah.
So it was a battle of gods, and David knew that. This was very much a theological warfare here. It was physical warfare, but it was very much theological in nature. As far as David was concerned, it was a battle of the gods, so to speak. Good. Anything else? Well, thank you very much for being here today, for braving the elements.
Thank you.
Don't know it's gonna get worse tonight.
Well,
Yeah,
that's
that's
what I
what
hear.
we lucked out.
That's what I hear.
Yeah.
And tomorrow.
Yeah, it'll be cold tomorrow.
If you can read it, you might have scribbled it.
Yeah.
They're not having.
Oh my.
So
In the
what do we
morning?
read for next week?
Oh, thank you very much for saying that, because there is very specific homework for next week. Yes, thank you, and I'm gonna write it on the board because it's easier that way. So if you will read 1 Samuel 16, this is, you probably already read it, but just refresh. 23, 14 to 23. And then chapters 18 through 20. All right, and then finally, what do I have here? No, not finally. Chapter 23. I'll explain why this is so disjointed a little bit, or it looks like it's disjointed. 23, 16 through 18, and then 2 Samuel 1. 17 through 27. So there's 4 sections
That's a lot
there.
to read for me.
Is it a lot to
I'm
read
a
for
slow
you?
reader.
Well, you have a whole week.
Yeah.
You
It'll
divide
take
it
me
up.
that.
This is easy peasy. You may have already read that. This is 3
Yeah.
chapters, but they go fairly quickly. They're easy to read, of
Yeah.
course. And this is just 2-3 verses, and then that's not very much.
Is that
Anyway.
chapter 16 verses 14 through 23?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I thought you meant all of it.
No. Chapter 16, this is just the end of the chapter. Chapters 18, 19, and 20. And then chapter 23, those few verses, 16 to 18. And then 2 Samuel 1, 17 to 27. The reason why is because when I first outlined this class a couple months ago, I had about 13 classes. I mean, that's a big topic. I was glad I got it down to 13. But, now I'm trying to even condense it a little bit more, so that we're not here forever. So I'm combining actually 2 ideas next week. So today's study was David in the valley. Last week was David in the field. Today was David in the valley, and next week we're going to look at David in court, in the king's court.
Okay.
And then we're going to also examine David in relationship or in friendship. That would be with Jonathan. So I decided to combine those 2, just because it would have been too much to try to stretch it out into 2 classes, so I can condense it all into 1. So that's why all the reading and why it looks disconjointed, but this all is gonna talk about the same ideas, same things.
We can
David in the king's court and David in friendship with Jonathan.
That's not
Alright?
as much as I thought it was
All
gonna be.
right.
It's all those chapters.
We can do it.
I was like, I can't do
You
that.
can do it.
We can do it.
Yeah, you can do it. Okay. We took names last week for women who would like to lead us in prayer at the end of class. And Connie and Nona were actually next, but they're not here. Are you up to doing it today, Susan? You're actually next on the list. Do you
Sure.
mind? Okay.
Sure.
Father God, we're so grateful for the opportunity to be here today to dig deeper into the life and times of David. And we are so grateful for what it shows us in overcoming fear and having the faith to do that. And Father, we thank you so much, as always, for Veronica, her love for studying your word and the way she presents it to us and helps us to understand. Be with each and every one who is here today and take us safely home in the rain. And for those that weren't able to be with us today, Lord, for whatever reason, we pray that you be with them also. Thank you for loving us, for watching over us, and always for your sovereignty over us. We're so grateful. We love you, Lord. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Susan.
You're welcome. Anybody want to go to lunch? Yeah.